when we do an extreme heat story, way too often you get people licking ice cream, people jumping into swimming pools. It looks like fun because we're used to telling that story, right? Of the warm day that's fun, and it is fun. But now, because the heat is getting more extreme, it's really getting dangerous for people.
Welcome back, everybody. Richard Ricker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of the Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. In this episode, I'm extremely excited to be joined by the extreme heat editor of Climate Resilience for All, Laurie Goering. Laurie is an award-winning climate change journalist and editor with a passion for storytelling and working with frontline journalists across the world to develop other great climate change storytellers. As part of her work, she's also been the founder and head of climate programs at Thomson Reuters Foundation, where the news website on human impacts for global warming, recruiting and managing a team of Global South freelance writers in Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It's an impressive body of work that started back in the States covering environmental issues around 30 years ago, and she's really been focused on environmental, climate, and now extreme heat. And I'm really excited to be speaking with her because as we've had a number of other conversations recently, learning to tell the story of these challenges is itself its own challenge. But learning to turn those words into something inspirational, engaging, so that we can make progress is a craft in and of itself. And so I'm really happy to have you join us, Laurie. It's just great to have you here.
It's so nice to be with you, Richard.
So as a starting point, great to have a personal introduction and the work that you're doing.
Sure. I'm a climate change journalist. I've been a journalist pretty much all my life. I knew I wanted to write and poetry wasn't going to pay, so journalism was what I went into, and knew about climate change. But it was this problem of the future, that was one that our grandchildren were going to deal with. And we were still thinking about it because we needed to act. But then when I was based in South Africa, I actually saw it on the ground for the first time and thought, wow, people are not being honest with us about how fast this is coming. So then I started focusing much more on climate change.
And back then there weren't a lot of people talking about it. As you mentioned, I think in '92 we had the first conference. What were some of the topics that you were covering? You mentioned the trees as like maybe the first story, one of the early stories. What were some other stories back then that you gravitated towards, or that when you were publishing, readers were really asking for more information about?
I think that the nature stories are a natural sell with the public. That people, almost everyone loves nature at some level, or at the very least appreciates national parks or things like that. So that was a fairly easy way in. And then it was talking about some of the trade-offs with energy and coal, is the most polluting fossil fuel and the one that we're trying to get away from first. So I was in Australia looking at some of these huge new coal mines that were expanding and opening up and, asking these questions like, how compatible is that with where we need to be?
Were those stories nature and environment, or were they climate change, and were they general awareness, like we're not heading the right direction, or were you able to be more of an activist kind of, this is what happens if we don't change?
I think you could see even then that these problems of climate change were going to be ones all of us were going to face, but obviously the people facing them the earliest are those that have the least resources to deal with the problem, or that live in places that are more vulnerable. I think throughout my career I've had this real desire. I know from my own travels and reporting that people all around the world are exactly like us. They have exactly the same desires and goals and aspirations, but they just are in this situation that any of us could have been born into. And I think I've really, throughout my career, wanted to help people to emphasize and understand that, to really know that these are, these problems that are facing people are real human challenges that we're going to face too. So I've spent a lot of time doing that and trying to tell those stories from the front line.
Tell me a little bit more about your career. So you're at Chicago Tribune, then you go to Thomson Reuters. What was the work that you were doing there, and how did you, I won't say take this more seriously, but how did you tip the focus? How did you learn to tell the story differently? How did you empower the journalists that you were engaging with to help tell their story as well?
Yeah, it was interesting for me, that transition, because I had been a generalist reporter. I covered everything. Environment and climate things were close to my heart, and I did a lot of it, but it wasn't everything. And so suddenly when I made that transition, I was covering only climate change. And this was still at a time when a lot of major media weren't putting much of any resource into that. And so I think we kind of saw that there were two things we could do with that. One was they had just hired me to write about climate change. And I said, this is just, it's not happening where I am. So let's spend this money and create this network of people who are there. I can improve their stories and help them to tell them. And so that's what we did. And that was hugely not only brought out these stories that a lot of journalists weren't finding, but it also trained these people, to look for these stories and to go out and really question. And they're leading a lot of the great coverage out in the world and have gone on to, wonderful careers.
So what kind of individuals were you training or engaging with, and what skills or what frameworks or what tools were you supporting them with?
What I was really looking for was great reporters because, if your first language is not English, it's not easy to write a beautiful story in perfect English. And that wasn't what I cared about. But I needed to find people that really understood how to be a good reporter, how to ask hard questions, how to get balance in stories, talk to all the right people, make sure, that things were accurate. Over time, we came to this structure that I laugh now because a lot of the kind of solutions journalism framework that's out there of, trying to tell these stories about solutions, we were thinking in a similar line in that so many of these stories are about misery and terrible things that happen. And we always asked reporters to say, okay, what would have improved this situation or what would improve it now? Is that happening? If it's not happening, why is it not happening? And we always explored that avenue, which was I think really, really useful because it would then lead on to the next stories. So it kept it from being stories of misery. It was stories looking at roadblocks and pinch points and the potential for what could change things. And sometimes it did because it came into the conversation.
I would imagine like the first early years, it's like that easy fruit off the tree, like, oh, easy story. They weren't really looking for too much depth. But then over time, as they got closer and closer and closer to the root structure, they started to see all the interconnections. And I'm curious, how did that change the topics or the reporting or the depth over your time there?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the beginning we did lots of stories about little things, that were all very good. There was solar powered water pumps and but they were often small scale, and that was fine at the beginning because these were new ideas. But then when a reporter is again proposing that story 5 or 7 or 10 years down the line, you're thinking, okay, we're just going around in circles here. We're not scaling up the things that need to happen. It's all just these little projects. So then two things happened. We really changed and said, we're not looking at any small scale stuff anymore. Now it has to be something that is really scalable. Scaling has the finance in place to do that. It's going to make a big difference to a lot of people. So it began to move out into this macro space of the systems that were keeping the change that needed to happen from happening. And I think as climate change impacts have increased, we've also begun to look at the things of where this could go. I mean, it started out looking at purely mitigation of climate change, changing the energy system. Then we had to adapt because we weren't doing it fast enough. And now we have loss and damage. And then I think we're going to get into things like geoengineering, which, are, if it all is really problematic, are we willing to do some pretty frightening things to change our systems to try to keep ourselves safe?
Getting back to the journalists that you were working with, you were saying like you don't care if they can say, write a great English story, but that they had to be great, journal. What made for a good journalist, or what were the ingredients that someone needed to have that led you to believe like this is someone who can be trained, who can be equipped, and can tell a unique story or can tell a story that's really going to be engaging?
Yeah, I mean, it's people that are curious, I think, and really willing to get out there in the front lines and listen. And I think really being willing to ask, to push on emotions and how people feel. It's not just facts. The number of times I've told people the quote is not, my maize harvest went from 4 to 6, 100 kilos of something. It's, my God, I've now got, more money than I've ever had, and my kids are fed. It's learning to look for those human stories and the feeling that's behind the facts, because the feeling is what people engage with. Having that real ability to connect with people and persuade them to tell you their real stories and not just answer dry questions. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I saw on Facebook a couple days ago, like the 2 or 3 year anniversary of the San Francisco fires, where I think I forget what they had a name for it as well. It was like, yeah, the whole city turned orange and red. It was just so eerie, right? And it's like those visuals that really hold people sometimes.
Completely. That's actually one of the things in my new job that I'm working on right now is we you can see that the visuals of extreme heat are not at all good. I mean, we still, when we do an extreme heat story, way too often you get people licking ice cream, people jumping into swimming pools, people, it looks like fun because we're used to telling that story, right? Of the warm day that's fun. And it is fun. But now, because the heat is getting more extreme, it's really getting dangerous for people. So I think we need to, on visuals, we need to much more show that side of heat so people do grasp that it's not just fun and there's no need to worry about things.
Back up a little bit, what is the job of an extreme heat editor? Like, how did you come into this role, and what is the work now that you're not the journalist yourself, but you're editing or curating some of this content? Like, what's your role, and what are you doing to how do you look at telling the story of extreme heat?
Well, extreme heat is a hard thing, right? I think most people are still not aware that it is the biggest killer of the climate impacts, more than the floods, more than the storms, more than anything else. But it's invisible. It needs a lot more thinking about because the heat is coming on really, really quickly. Last year was the hottest year in recorded history. This year is almost certainly going to be the hottest year in recorded history. And the thing is that we're getting to temperatures that are not just hot and unpleasant, but that are actually life-threatening in lots of places. So I think we really need to talk about these risks and how you mitigate those, how you begin to think in a different way about heat to try to make yourself safer.
It's a challenge, and I guess my question to follow up with that is like, first up, how do you tell that story and engage people? Because people can get turned off pretty quickly, and as a follow up to that, like, who are you speaking to? Are you trying to get the general public to care about extreme heat, or is it more like we need policymakers who have the ability to make influential decisions and investments to actually understand this? And so you're more writing to that group.
Yeah, I think there's elements of both of those, but I do think, I mean, I've done journalism now for a while that has been nonprofit and so, funded by various philanthropical things. And I am seeing a shift in what those funders are interested in, which is, instead of just how many hits do you have on the story on the website, it's have you reached the 5 or 10 people that are really the ones who will be making the decisions on this and that need to understand this. And so I do think there's elements of both. The good thing is when you tell good human stories that are really engaging, everybody will read that, right? Policymakers will read it and the general public will. And it's worth all kinds of people understanding it.
How do you approach storytelling to make sure that it's a both of like, right now we need to worry about this, but also it's just accessible and compelling for the broader audiences?
I think there's a few aspects to that. One is that we're in the climate change world, the deeper you get into it, we tend to talk in too much jargon among ourselves, and that can end up in the stories too. And it's really hard for people to engage with that. And I often tell writers I work with to try to tell this story like you're telling it to your grandmother or your next door neighbor. Just think about it that way. If you can't explain that in a way that you would to them, that's what the reader is going to need as well to really be able to engage with you. But I think also that this issue of the negative reporting is really super challenging. I struggle with this all the time personally because I can see I've talked to enough scientists over more than 20 years now to know how dire the situation we are in is. And you feel like to be honest and accurate, you want to warn people about that and be quite honest about it. But also you if you do too much of that, it's natural for them to turn away and say, oh, I can't engage with this. This is too much mentally and emotionally, and you're not giving me anything to do about it. Is you always have to let people do something with that angst they feel about this. But I think you don't want to, at the same time, you don't want to tell these kind of overly positive, soft stories that are not real. We can tell better stories of progress and opportunity and the better life that you can have if we do address climate change. Because the truth is the air will be cleaner, the energy will be cheaper, we'll be less reliant on imports and exports, in an uncertain world where the extremes are sometimes making that kind of trade-off harder.
Well, and I don't think this is say, a journalist issue. I mean, this is a sustainability complex issue. Like, there are tons of conferences where people just stand on stage, they spend 49 minutes on, look at all that's going wrong, and the last sentence is, but if you act now, we can avert all this. But I'm curious, like, can we tell the stories better? Like, if we talk about climate change, and let's talk about, say, Midwest farmers, because I know you spent a lot of time in the Midwest and I'm from the Midwest. Farmers, broad stroke, Republican, and in that space, therefore, they align with more the anti-climate or climate skeptic messaging. But if you talk to them as farmers about how their crops have changed, about weather patterns, about water availability, like about the things that are actually directly linked to climate change without using that terminology, they switch on. Is that a way to communicate differently? It's like, look, remove the big picture of climate change and how the orb is going to turn to a fireball, but how women are impacted, or how farmers are impacted, or how the elderly are impacted, like drawing those personal.
No, I totally agree with you. I think that communicators around climate change go in wanting to communicate what they want to communicate, but that's not how you successfully communicate anything, right? You have to talk to people about what they're interested in. So I think if you want to talk to them, you've got to figure out what it is that climate change is impacting in their lives that they're concerned about. And then you can broaden out the conversation. You can find quite a lot of things to talk to people about and talk about those first, that's what's really interesting. We've just been doing a bit of reporting around the Olympics, and Sebastian Coe, who is a middle distance gold medalist for Britain, and with a bunch of other athletes, were saying, the Olympics now, when you hold them in the summer, we really need to think about changing the month that those are held because it's so hot. Sports, football, tennis, all these things people care about very much. And, it's starting to be dangerous not only for the players, but the spectators. This is the kind of stuff I think where you can really engage people.
Taking that a bit further, there's sources that you trust, but there's also mediums that are more effective. And I'm curious, what have you learned about the mediums for communication, photography, video, long form journalism, memes? Are there more effective tools for communicating these issues? And is it more about who you're talking to and the subject, or how do you view each of those mediums? Because they must all have a role.
Yeah, they do. And I think it's really, again, about your audience. I think some of the most effective things that I've seen are actually combine all of those. You see some really beautiful multimedia stories now with, great images, with a timeline that you can move through, with graphics that really very visually show problems that might be hard to grasp because the numbers are so big. And that kind of thing is really good, I think, because everybody has a preference for how they understand the story, and there'll be people that will look at that won't read the whole story, but will move through the graphics and the images, and it just makes it accessible to a wider range of people.
Is there, like you mentioned, like these multimedia, are there some examples you can think of, like on issues that have been done really well?
We did a project last year about the end of insurance in the United States. We could see that the insurance model was no longer holding up for homeowners, and that likely it was going to become affordable or just completely unavailable. And one of the things we did was create a little gadget where you could put in your postcode and look at the average insurance costs and how they were changing for different things. And that's going to drive a lot of engagement.
How often do you look at the back end of these reports or these portfolios that you're putting out there and saying, look, we put out this insurance calculator and we found that they got through this step, 1, 2, 3, they then bounced to this resource, and then this is what can you figure that out and actually follow what is engaging and how, if you do it right, the engagement goes from maybe a little bit more surface to a little deeper? Like, can you measure that? And is that important to measure so that you know how to better deliver the stories that you're trying to aim for?
Yeah, definitely. In my previous job, we had an audience team that, was really tracking this as much as possible and looking at where things were picking up and, where people were moving around and what they looked at next and that kind of thing. So it does really inform. It led to us doing many more of these kind of explainer formats because often these topics are complicated. And I do think that that judging the impact of stories too, though, is not just on the on that, but on now increasingly on are you reaching those right people? Is it how is it changing the conversation? This end of insurance story, we had this before anyone else, and we to our amazement, we put out a story about how wildfires in California were, making insurance affordable and how that market was just not going to hold up. And 10 days later, State Farm Insurance pulled out of California and decided they weren't writing new policies. And suddenly we had every major media in the United States was chasing that story and following it up. That is impact, right?
You see these kind of watershed moments, and it's all just effective communication and timing as well, and having all the resources actually already ready. I felt like that's something that you can be right, and you can be on time, but if you don't have everything behind it, if you haven't been doing the work, it's hard to capture the momentum and actually drive a little bit further.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to stick with things. I look back and I think we had done 200 stories on insurance over the years, over 15 years. So, it's a lot of time, but we knew we were watching, and this is something I think is important in journalism is to, spend time, get to know the topics. It really does give you this sense of foresight about what's coming next. And that can put you out, ahead and give you something that will be really engaging to an audience because they haven't seen it before, rather than sometimes I think in journalism there's a tendency to kind of jump on the bandwagon of what you see a story, everybody else has done it, so you need to do it too. It's not the way to get ahead.
A bit of reflection. Been in this for a few decades. You've put out hundreds, thousands of reports. What are some core principles that you keep coming back to for telling the story and telling it well, or telling it as well as you can?
You really need to talk about, a human story, someone that's relatable, because what we need to act on climate change is not just the information, the facts, but I think the empathy and the understanding. So that is a big priority. I think you need to find that balance between the often scary reality and the potential much better future and possibility, and just navigate that with a lot of deftness. And I think in journalism, climate change journalism, there can be a real tendency to veer between those very scary stories and the kind of overly optimistic stories about how carbon credits are going to save us or geoengineering is going to save us, or that if you look deeper behind those, they're very likely not to save us. They're part of a much broader picture of things we might do about stuff. So it's really parsing that and not over amping the kind of solutions that may be false solutions and not scaring people so they just totally won't read what you're doing anymore. And it's really hard. It's really hard. I mean, I struggle with that a lot.
You've had enough experience to know kind of where we're headed. And based on a couple of comments, I can tell you see a lot of growing challenges. You're not looking at the beauty side right now, you're really seeing the challenge side. How much have you learned to dial that in, rein it back, separate yourself emotionally, just focus on the content? Or have you started to release that a little bit? Like, you know what, we need this emotion to be evoked and to come into the mixture here because people need to understand like this is pressing. They do need to act. Like you mentioned, it's difficult, but what are some of the ways or the practices or the tools that you apply to make sure you have the right balance there?
You do grasp what these things mean. I have two children, and I think about this a lot. It's part of the reason I'm doing what I'm doing at the moment around extreme heat. I'm experimenting a little with being at an NGO that is attempting to do something about this. I do see among journalists this desire in some cases to just to engage with all this. It's very hard increasingly to set it aside totally. I do see more journalists struggling with this a bit.
So, on that note, and thinking about the next generation, if you were speaking to an aspiring climate journalist or maybe someone early in their career, what advice would you give to them as they look to make an impact through their climate reporting?
I think that the path in journalism has really changed since I started. It's useful to study something besides journalism. Journalism is useful to study, but I think it's really valuable to study finance or study the environmental issues or learn a lot about coding so you can do really interesting investigative work. I think about where you want to sit in this really, really different ecosystem than existed a while ago when the outlets were different. Think about social media and that it's a powerful tool and where you want to sit with that. And yeah, I mean, there's huge opportunity out there. It's just really different than it was when I started.
How do you recommend young journalists find their voice or find their medium that they're going to excel at, enjoy, and find impact through?
I think you have to get out there and decide what you're good at. I mean, if you're a photographer, a videographer, that's what you can do. I think you can also, I've seen a lot of success from people picking a topic that they care a lot about and, really creating a body of work around that ends up becoming their thing. And I think there's some rich areas that you could do that in. For instance, there's a lot to be done about mental health around climate change in two different ways because of the impacts and also because of the kind of emotional problem. You hear a lot about climate anxiety and that kind of thing, but displacement of people from climate impacts, including in Fiji a couple of years ago. And you're seeing how extreme heat, it keeps people up at night, right? When it's super hot, you don't sleep. And there's mental health impacts from that. There's rising domestic violence. There's a lot of things related to work. If you don't sleep at night, you're not at your peak in work, and there's many more work accidents. There's a lot of more mistakes made, and what does that mean for our economy and for productivity? There's so many different, really interesting areas I think you could spend time. I would just urge rather than bouncing around from whatever is trending on social media today. Pick something you care about, you have access to, and dig into it. There are things happening everywhere.